In 1989, a nun walked out of her convent and was never seen again. No note, no body, just silence that lingered for nearly 3 decades. Then, 27 years later, a construction crew renovating an old church building made a discovery beneath the floorboards, one that cracked open the past. What they found was not just evidence, it was a secret never meant to be unearthed. Before we begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there. It really means a lot to know that you're with us. We're going through this together. Now let me tell you what really happened. Samuel Monroe, 45 years old, lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by dense pine forests at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. That morning, as usual, he sat sipping coffee in front of a fuzzy television screen broadcasting a local religious program. On the screen, an elderly pastor was preaching about perseverance in faith, with a soft glow of blue and purple light streaming through the stained glass windows behind him. The gentle sounds brought no peace to Samuel. They only stirred a deep, desiccated memory. He couldn't recall the last time he prayed. Perhaps it was in 1989, the very summer his mother, Sister Mary Catherine, disappeared from the convent without a word of farewell. Since then, faith had become to him like an old cloak, once a source of comfort, now a burden. The shrill ring of the telephone suddenly cut through the gloomy atmosphere of the living room. Samuel set his coffee down and stood up slowly. When he picked up the receiver, a woman's voice came through, calm but firm. "Mr. Monroe, this is Inspector Sarah Harvey from the Greene County Police Department. We have some findings we need you to verify concerning your mother's disappearance." Samuel's heartbeat faltered. "This is real?" he asked, his voice raspy with surprise. "That case was over 20 years ago." "I understand your skepticism," she replied, unhurried. "This morning, a construction crew renovating an old house near the former Baptist convent discovered a hidden wooden compartment beneath the floor. Inside were an old leather bag, a nun's habit, and a Bible engraved with your mother's name." A long silence followed. Samuel stared at an old photo of his mother hanging on the wall. In it, she smiled gently, holding a holy book, a white veil covering her head. That image, once a source of solace, now stung like a reopened wound. I need to be there," Samuel said quickly. "I'm coming." "We can send someone to pick you up if needed," Sarah offered. "No need. Send me the address. I'll drive myself." Less than an hour later, Samuel arrived at the scene, a decaying 2-story wooden house that had once served as a guest residence for the old convent and was now being renovated to expand the parish grounds. Yellow police tape cordoned off the entrance. A few officers and engineers were working out front, and a police cruiser was parked off to the side. Inspector Sarah Harvey approached to meet him. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with short salt and pepper hair and a composed face that did not smile but wasn't cold. Samuel shook her hand without saying a word. "This house is directly behind the old convent," she said, leading him inside. "As you may know, it used to accommodate visiting members. While dismantling the floorboards on the ground level, a team of workers discovered a sealed hollow space. They notified us immediately upon finding the bag." They walked through a narrow hallway, the floor covered in sawdust and dust, and arrived at a section draped in white plastic sheets. Beneath the floor, a square wooden cavity was exposed, about half a meter wide. Inside was a dark, worn leather bag. Beside it lay a piece of gray fabric, the remains of a nun's habit. Samuel was speechless. As a gloved officer opened the leather bag, he saw a small Bible with a black leather cover. In the top inside corner, faint handwritten letters read, "Mary C. Monroe." He stepped closer and bent down as if kneeling at a funeral. "This is my mother's name," he whispered, his hands trembling. "And this is her handwriting. I'm sure of it." Sarah nodded slightly. "We'll send the hair strands found in the habit and the leather strap from the bag for DNA testing, but it seems she either left these things intentionally or was forced to." Samuel opened the Bible. Many pages were stained, but one near the back had been carefully folded. On it was a handwritten passage, prayers of despair, a psalm excerpt, and a single line, "Deliver me, Lord, from the betrayer within your house." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. She Knew something, he murmured. Possibly, Sarah replied. And if that's true, we need to find out why these items were hidden, and who hid them. Is the convent still operating? To a limited extent. Some elderly members still live there. I've reached out, but I haven't disclosed today's discovery. Samuel was silent for a moment. I want to go there. I need to meet the people who lived and worked with my mother. Sarah looked at him, as if gauging the strength of his resolve. Then she nodded. We'll support you, but be careful. If someone hid these things for nearly 3 decades, they probably don't want the truth uncovered. One of the officers gently turned to the last page of the Bible, where a small piece of paper was tucked between 2 pages. It looked like a personal prayer, a daily note the nuns often wrote during their meditations. But as Samuel read it, he immediately understood this was not just an ordinary plea. The handwriting was shaky yet urgent, as if written in panic. Lord, if you are truly listening, please deliver me from this darkness. Why do those who serve you so evil? Please shield me from the betrayal within your own house. Samuel's throat tightened. It's my mother's handwriting. Definitely hers. I remember when she taught me to copy Bible verses every night in the little study behind the convent. Inspector Sarah Harvey nodded. We believe so. The handwriting closely matches the letters of hers we have on file. Another officer carefully lifted the nun's habit out of the bag. Though stained with time, it still retained some of its shape. Inspector Harvey held it up and examined the inside of the collar, where a faint embroidered line read, Sister Mary C. We'll send fabric samples and organic material from the habit to the state lab, she said. The equipment here is limited. We may also need a DNA sample from you for comparison. Samuel nodded. I agree. Do whatever's necessary to verify. He leaned down, gently brushing his hand along the sleeve. It felt like touching a distant memory. This size, it's my mother's. She was short but broad-shouldered. Her habits always had slightly long sleeves like this. He looked up and met Sarah's gaze. Is it possible someone murdered her? Inspector Harvey was silent for a few seconds before replying. There are no clear traces of blood or injuries on the evidence, but considering these items were hidden beneath the floor, inside a secret compartment, that suggests someone didn't want them ever to be found. She paused for a beat. It's also possible she hid them herself, to protect someone, or herself. No, Samuel said firmly. My mother wasn't one to run. She would never abandon her faith, her community, or me, unless she was forced to. Another officer chimed in. The compartment was skillfully built, the floorboards were removed and reinstalled very carefully, and the surrounding area was repainted. Whoever did this planned it. This house was originally built in the early 20th century, Tom, a structural engineer standing nearby, added, but this section of the floor was renovated around the 1980s, according to town records. If I'm right, the person who hid these things knew the layout well and planned in advance. Sarah nodded and took notes. We'll look into all renovation records and who had access to this house during that time. She then turned to Samuel. At the convent, or in the community where your mother served, was there anyone who had conflicts with her? Someone who might not have wanted her to speak the truth about something? Samuel thought for a moment. My mother was principled, but she wasn't confrontational. Still, I remember in the years before she disappeared, she would often stay up all night praying. Her eyes were always tired. He paused, then spoke slowly. There were a few people at the convent who didn't like her. They thought she was too rigid, not in line with the gentle spirit of service, especially Mother Agnes and Sister Georgia. Sarah glanced at her notebook. Those names sound familiar. Are they still alive? Yes, I believe they still live at the old convent. We'll reach out to them, Sarah said. For now, we'll seal off this house, document the scene, and send all evidence for testing. As police took photos and recorded the scene, Samuel requested copies of the documents. Sarah agreed to send them once legal procedures were completed. That afternoon, Samuel was driven home, but instead of resting, he went straight to his personal archive, where he kept everything that remained from his mother's time, It was a small room with wooden walls and only 2 narrow windows. On the shelves were sermon books, personal diaries, letters, and church documents, all neatly arranged. His mother had always been meticulous. He ran his fingers along the spines, each labeled by year in black ink. 1985, 1986, 1987, then 1988, and after that, a gap. Samuel frowned, checking 3 times. There was nothing labeled 1989, the year she disappeared. He searched the drawer, the metal box under the desk, a few loose letters, some notes with work schedules, but still nothing from 1989. "That's impossible," he murmured. "She never forgot to archive. Maybe someone took it." He slumped down, leaning against the wall. The image of the Bible under the floor returned to him. The desperate prayer, the habit, the all-consuming silence. Something had happened, and it began that year. Samuel stood up suddenly. He needed to go to the convent. He couldn't wait another second. The drive back up the hills took over 20 minutes. The old Baptist convent appeared like a faded painting. Gray stone walls, brown-tiled roof, surrounded by trees with crimson autumn leaves. When he pulled up to the gate, the iron door was still ajar, as it had been for years. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The convent hallway was silent. A few rugs were worn thin, the walls lined with dark bronze crucifixes. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air. In the guest room, he met Mother Agnes Whitmore, a woman nearing 80, her silver hair neatly tied back, her steps slow but her eyes still sharp. "Samuel?" she said, astonished. "Good heavens, is that really you?" Samuel nodded. "I came to ask about my mother and the year 1989. A long silence fell. Then Mother Agnes sighed. "Perhaps it's time the old truths come to light." Mother Agnes Whitmore nodded with quiet understanding. At that moment they heard the back door open and another elderly woman entered. Mother Agnes called out loudly, "Sister Georgia, look who's here!" Sister Georgia Langston, one of the oldest surviving nuns at the convent, entered the guest room with a linwood cane in hand. When she saw Samuel, she walked slowly toward him, her eyes flickering with something unusual. Not quite surprise, not quite joy, but perhaps apprehension. "Samuel Monroe," she said, her voice raspy and trembling. "It's been a very long time." Both Mother Agnes and Sister Georgia looked at him, then exchanged glances. It seemed his presence had unsettled them. "I came to learn about my mother," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice calm, "and about the year 1989. I found some evidence beneath the floor of a house near the convent. A leather bag, a nun's habit, and a Bible engraved with her name." The 2 nuns remained silent. Only the ticking of a wall clock echoed in the still room. "You think your mother was murdered?" Agnes asked, eyes fixed on Samuel's face. "I don't know what happened," he replied. "But if those items were buried instead of discarded, then she must have wanted them to be found, or someone wanted to hide them." Sister Georgia slowly took a seat. "Your mother was a good woman, Samuel, a gentle nun. But sometimes being too honest is a sin in a place like this." "What do you mean?" Samuel frowned. "It's just that—" She paused, her eyes distant. She had many questions. There were nights she stayed up late praying. When asked, she'd only say she was fighting the darkness with faith. Samuel grew thoughtful. "I'm here today because I'm looking for something important, my mother's personal journal and sermon notes from 1989. I have every year before that, but that one year is missing." He pulled a small yellowed notebook from his bag, the type his mother always used. She always used these same notebooks, starting from the early 80s, but I've looked everywhere and can't find the one from the year she disappeared. Agnes took the notebook and flipped through a few pages. "I remember this type, but I never saw her bring one into the common room. Maybe it was kept somewhere secure." Georgia pursed her lips. "Perhaps in the library, or her old office, behind the archives." The 3 of them left the guest room, passing through an old corridor where sunlight streamed through colored glass windows, casting pale hues on the cold stone floor. They arrived at the room that had once been Sister Mary Catherine's office, now dusty, silent, and seemingly frozen in time. They began searching drawers, bookshelves, and file boxes. Everything was neatly arranged, just like Samuel's mother had always done, but there was nothing labeled 1989. They moved on to the library. The light there was dimmer, the towering shelves casting long shadows. It was eerily quiet. Each of them took a different section, opening drawers, flipping through piles of old papers. Samuel carefully placed his sample notebook on the long table in the center of the room, turned on a desk lamp to see more clearly. They searched for nearly an hour, still nothing, no trace of the missing notebook. Samuel straightened up and sighed. "Thank you both for helping. I know time makes everything fade, but I was hoping for even the smallest clue." Mother Agnes nodded. "If I find anything, I'll let you know, no matter how late." Before leaving, Samuel knelt at one of the pews in the chapel, the place once filled with his mother's singing during early morning services. He bowed his head and whispered a prayer as soft as breath. "Lord, if you once lived in my mother's heart, please let me see what she saw. Just once." On the drive home, Samuel felt as though he was carrying more than what he had brought. Not a clue, but doubt, a sense that the truth wasn't lost to time, but deliberately hidden. A short way past the convent gate, he suddenly froze. "Damn it," he muttered. "I left the sample notebook on the library table." Still, he decided to go back later. For now, his mind had drifted elsewhere. Instead of returning home, Samuel turned left at the old crossroads leading out of town, to where the family cemetery lay on a hillside. He hadn't visited since his father passed away. He pulled over and bought a bouquet of white chrysanthemums from a small roadside flower shop. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with clouded but kind eyes, looked at him curiously. "Special occasion, young man?" "Visiting my mother," he replied. "It's been far too long." The cemetery, in the quiet of autumn afternoon, felt like another world. The hills were draped in golden red maple leaves. Samuel walked slowly among the weathered gravestones until he found the modest stone engraved with Sister Mary Catherine Monroe, a woman of faith and courage. He sat on the grass in front of the grave, placed the flowers, and began to speak. About the bag, the Bible, the strange look in Sister George's eyes, and the prayer his mother left behind. He spoke as though she were there, listening. "I don't know where you are, Mom, but I know you didn't run. You didn't abandon me. I want to know the truth, whatever it is." Suddenly, he heard soft sobbing, out of place among the silent graves. He turned and saw a young boy curled up beneath an oak tree, his shoulders trembling from fever and sorrow. Samuel approached and gently asked, "Are you okay?" The boy turned. His small, pale face was streaked with tears. "My name's Paul," he whispered. "Paul Hark." Samuel looked around. "Where are your parents?" Paul pointed to a nearby grave. "My mom's there. My aunt and uncle don't like me." Samuel's heart sank. Memories of being placed in foster care after losing his mother and having his father vanish came flooding back like icy water. "You have a fever," Samuel said, placing a hand on Paul's forehead. "I need to take you to the hospital. I don't want to go home. Nobody cares there." Samuel sighed, then gathered his courage. "If you agree, I'll take you to the hospital. After that, I'll return to the convent to get the Eucharist and bring it to you, just like my mother used to do." Paul looked at him hopefully, then nodded quietly. They left the cemetery together. In the back seat, Paul leaned against the window, eyes heavy. Samuel drove in silence, but his mind was calmer than it had been in days. Amid all the unknowns, he had just begun a new journey, not only to find his mother, but to protect a child abandoned as he once was. And he didn't know that, back in the convent library, a small notebook with a gray leather cover still lay quietly on the table, under the dim yellow light, carrying the secret he had long been searching for. Samuel took Paul to the emergency room of the town hospital, quickly explaining to the nurse the boy's situation. That he had a high fever, was living with foster family members, and didn't want to go back. When the medical staff asked for contact information, Samuel had to admit he didn't know Paul's current address, but believed the hospital could trace his records. Before being wheeled into the examination room, Paul turned around, his eyes red from exhaustion and fear, but his voice still steady. "You promised about the Eucharist." "I remember," Samuel replied. placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'll come back soon and bring you the sacrament." After completing the admission and emergency deposit paperwork and providing his contact details, Samuel left the hospital. The sky had turned a deep golden hue as he stepped outside. The crisp early autumn air filled his chest, but his mind burned with restless thoughts. He got into the car and scrolled through the old contact list on his phone. One entry simply labeled Old Convent, Mother's Office. He tried calling, but the line only rang unanswered. Without waiting, he started the engine and drove straight to the convent. When he arrived, the courtyard was deserted, lit only by dim yellow light shining through the stained glass windows. Samuel entered through the side door. There was no sign of Mother Agnes or Sister Georgia. Instead, a young nun with brown hair tucked under a white veil was tidying books in the guest room. When she saw him, she paused. "You're Samuel, right?" she asked, recognizing him from the previous visit. "Yes, I left a notebook in the library yesterday. Also, I need to request a Eucharist set to bring to a boy in the hospital." The nun nodded, though she seemed slightly hesitant. "I'm not sure if Mother Agnes or Sister Georgia are still here. I heard they're out at the cemetery conducting a memorial service." "A service?" Samuel was surprised. "I don't recall the order holding late afternoon services in the cemetery." "I don't know for sure either, but sometimes they do. Ever since I arrived, I've seen it a few times. If you need something urgently, I'll help." Samuel smiled gratefully. "Then could you help me check the library quickly?" The two of them went to the convent library, the room Samuel had searched yesterday with Agnes and Georgia. As they entered, Samuel exhaled in relief. His mother's sample notebook was still there on the table, exactly where he had left it. He picked it up and brushed off a light layer of dust. "Lucky," he said. But just as he turned to leave, his eyes caught sight of a book on the top shelf. It was slightly protruding, tilted forward, as if someone had hastily pulled it out, then shoved it back. Curious, he reached up. The book was thicker and heavier than expected and thudded to the floor when he lost his grip. The pages fanned open. He crouched to pick it up and glanced at the title, Convent Financial and Administrative Records, 1980-1990. Blowing the dust off the cover, he carried it to the table. The pages opened with a dry rustle. Inside were accounting records, food expenses, liturgy fund allocations, roof repair costs. However, something felt off. Some pages had marginal notes, thin pencil lines, slanted handwriting. Not exactly his mother's, but familiar. It resembled handwriting he'd seen on a few old scraps she had left behind, likely quick notes she'd made. On a page near the end, listing expenditures for June 1989, one line had been faintly underlined in pencil. Convent basement renovations, $3,800. Beneath it was a nearly erased annotation. No invoice found, checked. And beside it, in very fine pencil, MC. Samuel's heart pounded. MC. Mary Catherine? He wasn't sure. Just two initials, unclear. But if his mother had written them, it meant she had once taken notice of the irregular expense. The library door creaked open. The young nun returned. "Did you find your notebook?" "Yes, thank you," Samuel said, then held up the convent financial records book. "I saw this on the shelf. Not sure if it can be borrowed?" She looked uncertain. "That one's part of the internal archive. Normally, no one borrows it out." "I understand," Samuel nodded, slowly placing it back down. "I'll wait to ask Mother Agnes then. But if I only borrow it overnight and promise to return it in the same condition?" She stared at him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'll log it into the internal borrowing sheet, but please don't show it to anyone else outside the hospital. This is sensitive material." "Promise." She quickly noted the book's title, date, and time. After signing, Samuel followed her to the Eucharist room. Along the way he mentioned, "I used to help my mother prepare sacrament bread for the sick. Not sure if the process has changed." She hesitated. "I'm afraid guests can't enter the Eucharist room. New policy, but I'll prepare it for you." Samuel nodded, understanding. He stood for a moment in the hallway outside the library, holding the Convent Financial and Administrative Records, 1980 to 1990 book close. The air in the convent carried a stillness where even small sounds became vivid. The wind through cracks, the creak of damp wooden walls. He opened the book, scanning the yellowed pages, the overhead light glinting off lines of figures. Many passages were marked in pencil, and some margins carried notes, not standard accounting marks but moral reflections. One line was triple underlined. Every dollar from the communal fund is a trust from God. Right beside it, in smaller writing, handling money is not just accounting, but a test of loyalty. Financial purity is a mirror for faith. Samuel paused. That handwriting, slightly slanted, bold at the starting strokes, was unmistakable. It was his mother's, exactly the style she used in her notebooks, sharp, restrained, but always full of resolve. Other margin notes confirmed it. Righteousness spares no one, not even those in habits. A leader must not touch sacred funds with greed. Samuel's heartbeat quickened. He tilted the book under the light for a better view. On a near final page, faint pencil markings had been erased, but the indentations remained, visible from an angle. He gently scratched the surface with a fingernail to reveal the remaining lead. 2 names, partially erased but still legible. Agnes Whitmore and Georgia Langston. Each name was circled with a fine loop, followed by a question mark. Below that, another hurried line, not erased. June account short by $10,300. No expense receipt confirmed. Samuel sat on a nearby wooden bench, gripping the book tightly. Questions surged. His mother had suspected the 2 highest-ranking nuns in the community, and she had recorded it, in her own handwriting, in the finance ledger. If this was true, then 1989 wasn't just the year she disappeared. It was the year she had come close to uncovering a truth someone didn't want revealed. From the hallway corner, through a narrow window looking out behind the convent, Samuel saw 2 figures in habits moving among the cemetery. One bent low to the ground. The other stood holding something resembling a cane. The slanted evening light cast long, blurred shadows, but the silhouettes, unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Before Samuel could examine further, the young nun returned, carrying a small cloth pouch, neatly tied. "Here you are," she said, offering the Eucharist pouch with reverence. "I've prepared it properly." "Thank you so much." Samuel accepted it. He glanced back out the window. "Do you know what they're doing out in the cemetery? I saw them from here." The nun followed his gaze. "Probably visiting old graves. Today is the death anniversary of a nun who passed many years ago. I'm not sure exactly. I was downstairs in the basement earlier." Samuel nodded, managing a faint smile. "I see." He left the convent carrying the Eucharist set, his mother's sermon notebook, and the heavy financial ledger. It felt like he was carrying a fragment of a truth hidden for nearly 30 years. As he stepped down the cold stone steps, one thought hit him square in the mind. This old convent doesn't just hold prayers, it's guarding a secret. Outside the convent, Samuel initially intended to head straight back to his car to return to the hospital. But as he stepped down the stone stairs, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to thank Mother Agnes and Sister Georgia for their help the day before. Another part, harder to define, urged him to double-check what he had seen through the library's window. 2 figures in habits at the cemetery, one digging the earth. He decided to circle around to the back gate, following a narrow path leading toward the old burial grounds. The evening light had nearly faded. Crimson maple leaves carpeted the ground in thick layers. The cemetery was cloaked in an unusual silence. As Samuel drew closer, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot sounded like a warning bell to those ahead. When he reached a remote corner of the cemetery, rarely visited, Samuel froze. In the dim twilight, he saw Sister Georgia using a small shovel to scoop soil from a shallow grave, while Mother Agnes stood beside her, clutching a frayed gray fabric bag. Neither of them noticed his approach. "Good evening," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice light but loud enough not to startle them by coming too close. Both nuns turned sharply. Agnes's eyes widened in brief surprise, while Georgia stepped slightly back, still holding the shovel. "Samuel?" Agnes called, louder than usual. "You came back?" "Sorry if I'm interrupting," Samuel replied, walking toward them slowly. I just returned to pick up a notebook I left in the library yesterday and to request a Eucharist kit for a boy in the hospital." He glanced at the shovel in Georgia's hand, then at the fabric bag Agnes held tightly against her body. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Agnes answered quickly, her voice calm. "We're just clearing out an old grave, Samuel. A parishioner buried a pet here back in the 80s. We were asked to relocate the ashes because the cemetery needs more space." Samuel nodded slightly, keeping his expression neutral, but something heavy settled in his chest. Moving a pet's grave? At dusk? Without notifying anyone? He didn't press further. "I see. Then I won't disturb you. Just wanted to let you know I've retrieved the notebook." Agnes glanced at the ledger in Samuel's hand. "You found it?" "Yes." Samuel raised the convent financial records book. "Funny thing, it fell off the shelf while I was looking around. I noticed a few handwritten notes from my mother inside and wanted to read more. The young sister helped me sign it out." Georgia remained still. Her hand tightened slightly around the shovel's handle. "Your mother also read that one very carefully," she said softly. "I'll return it in perfect condition by Sunday," Samuel said, stepping back. "I need to get back to the boy. I promised him the Eucharist." He turned away, but he could feel the eyes of both women tracking his every step as he left the graveyard. Back in the car, Samuel looked into the rearview mirror. Agnes and Georgia were still standing in place. They weren't digging, they weren't talking. Just standing side by side, heads slightly bowed in a silence that chilled him. Samuel gripped the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. Just as he was about to start the engine, his phone vibrated. A call from the hospital. "Mr. Monroe, this is Nurse Carter. Paul just woke up and he mentioned you. Something about a ritual?" "Yes, please tell him I'm on my way back." But as he prepared to leave, movement in the distance caught his eye. Sister Georgia was loading the shovel and the fabric bag into the trunk of the convent's old car, parked behind a row of trees. Agnes wasn't with her. Georgia got into the car and drove off quickly via a side exit that led into the hills behind the convent. Samuel frowned. That road didn't lead to any residential areas. It wound through sparse forest and up toward the ridge, a place rarely traveled at night. Hands still on the wheel, Samuel made a snap decision. He would follow. When Georgia's car turned onto the forest road, Samuel kept his distance. The thick canopy above blocked moonlight, plunging the road into near total darkness, his headlights the only source of visibility. He pulled out his phone and called Inspector Sarah Harvey. "Inspector Harvey, it's Samuel Monroe." "Mr. Monroe, what's going on?" "I'm following Sister Georgia from the convent. She just dug something from an old grave, claimed it was dog ashes. But now she's driving alone toward the mountain road, carrying a shovel and a cloth bag." There was a beat of silence. Then Sarah spoke, her tone sharp. "Don't follow her. Turn around right now. I'll send someone." "No, I believe this is connected to my mother's case. I need to see what she's planning." "All right, but keep your distance. No confrontation. Keep your phone on. I'm dispatching officers now." Samuel relayed his position as they ascended the hill, passing an abandoned ranger station. Finally, George's car stopped at a small clearing. Eagle's Rest Lookout, a scenic viewpoint overlooking the valley and river below. Samuel parked farther away, hidden behind a sharp bend. From there, he saw Georgia turn on a headlamp, open the trunk, and retrieve the bag and shovel. She walked slowly toward the wooden railing, then descended the stairs to a stone platform at the cliff's edge. "She's about to throw something over," Samuel whispered into the phone. "Police are en route," Sarah said. "Stay put." Samuel bit his lip. Georgia's headlamp flickered as she stopped on the wooden platform. She knelt down and opened the bag. He couldn't wait. He got out of the car. As Samuel neared the platform, he called out softly, "Sister Georgia?" The woman turned abruptly, her headlamp shining directly into his face. "Samuel, you followed me?" "What are you trying to throw over?" he asked, carefully stepping along the dark steps. Georgia stared at him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse. "You know already, don't you?" "Know what?" She didn't answer, but Samuel had gotten close enough to see inside the open bag on the stone platform. Inside were 2 dirt-stained notebooks. He recognized them instantly. His mother's 1989 sermon journal and a personal diary with the familiar worn leather cover. "These are my mother's!" Samuel gasped. The bag opened a little more. The light glinted off something pale, a small bone fragment. Samuel froze. "That's not dog ash," he said. "That's human." A police siren pierced the air in the distance. Georgia looked around, panicked. "I called them," Samuel said, voice trembling with emotion. "No one else has to die because of this secret." As they returned to the parking lot atop the hill, Samuel paused for a moment, turning his head to glance back at the stone platform near the cliff's edge. He knew he had just stopped an act of evidence destruction, and perhaps salvaged the final proof of what had happened to his mother, Sister Mary, 25 years ago. A cold evening breeze brushed the back of his neck. He pulled his coat closer and followed the police car back into town. At the station, when Samuel stepped into the main lobby, he saw a scene he hadn't expected so soon. Sister Georgia, in handcuffs, her head bowed, being escorted down the detention hallway by 2 officers. Her face was pale, stripped of the familiar calm composure. But what truly stunned him was the person walking behind her, Mother Agnes. No longer in religious garb, she wore a dark wool shawl, her exhaustion plain to see. As she passed Samuel, she paused for just a moment. Their eyes met. There was something unspoken in that gaze, not guilt, but regret, as if a game had ended. Samuel said nothing. He simply stood in silence. Inspector Harvey appeared and led him into a small interview room. On the table, the collected evidence had been carefully arranged. 2 dirt-covered notebooks, one a personal journal, the other Sister Mary's 1989 sermon ledger, the gray fabric bag, the small shovel, and in a stainless steel tray, fragments of bone, one of which was curved and round, resembling a part of a human skull. Samuel swallowed hard and stepped forward. "We believe these are your mother's remains," Inspector Harvey said gently. "We'll conduct DNA tests to confirm." Samuel nodded, trying to steady his voice. "Of course. For now, we need your full account of what you witnessed, especially at the lookout, and confirmation of the items." Over the next 2 hours, Samuel recounted everything in detail. The hospital call, the return to the convent, the suspicious behavior of Agnes and Georgia, the discovery of the fabric bag and the journals, and finally, the confrontation at the cliff's edge. Forensic technicians worked in parallel, meticulously processing the evidence. One officer, wearing thin latex gloves, carefully lifted the personal journal. "This one's nearly disintegrated," he said. "The leather cover's degraded, and the pages are stuck together from moisture and mold, but a few sections are still legible." He began using a surgical scalpel to separate some of the middle pages, where the damage appeared less severe. Under the surgical light, faded handwriting emerged. Samuel leaned in. He recognized it immediately, the familiar, slightly slanted, deliberate hand of his mother. "I tried to warn Agnes. It's not just about the money, not just about ledger entries. There's something darker happening beneath the basement. Georgia is no longer herself. I fear they are attempting a forbidden rite." Samuel clenched his fists. An officer beside him whispered, "We believe Agnes tried to destroy this at least once. There are light burn marks along the edge. But perhaps Georgia stopped her." They moved on to the sermon ledger, which was in much better condition. "Likely stored in a dry environment, possibly the library or an upper-floor office," the technician noted. The sermon book contained drafts from Lent of 1989, just weeks before Sister Mary disappeared. The final pages took a different tone: forgiveness, redemption, confronting inner wounds. One handwritten sermon was titled, "The Light Shines in the Darkest Place," referencing John chapter 1:5. "If man fears the light, it may be because he carries shame in the dark, but God does not shine light to punish, he shines to save. If we believe in grace, we cannot remain silent in the face of wrong." Samuel read the passage again and again, as though his mother were whispering to him from those decayed pages. 3 weeks after the arrest, the official investigation report from the state police was released. The report spanned over 200 pages, but for Samuel, only 3 lines in the summary were enough to weigh down his heart. Mother Agnes and Sister Georgia conspired to murder Sister Mary Catherine to prevent her from revealing the embezzlement of funds and misuse of convent assets. After assaulting the victim to the point of unconsciousness, they confined her in the basement chapel, where she died from blood loss and cranial trauma. Another line read, "Death was not immediate. The victim survived for at least 4 hours, as indicated by blood traces and a handwritten prayer found inside the wooden wall." And the final line, "After death, the body was wrapped in a nun's habit, placed in a sack, and buried beneath the grave of a deceased dog to avoid detection within the convent cemetery grounds." Behind these acts was a series of small events. An initial $10,000 withdrawn from the convent's account under the pretext of roof repair, later used to cover Mother Agnes's personal debt. A woman who had once vowed a life of poverty. Georgia, as assistant treasurer, colluded by accidentally losing the accounting ledgers from that year. When Sister Mary Catherine discovered the discrepancies, she tried to confront them privately, following biblical procedure. But she hadn't foreseen the level of desperation the two women would reach to conceal their guilt. There was no grand conspiracy, no secret cult behind the scenes, just two women, once revered by the community, who feared the truth so much that they were willing to kill one of their own sisters, to kill Samuel's mother. Police also recovered numerous shredded financial records stuffed beneath the basement wall, the same wall Georgia had unearthed that night. Though heavily damaged, the documents matched undocumented fund withdrawals. Several personal notebooks belonging to Agnes also reflected her psychological breakdown after the death, but none contained a single line of remorse. Both women are now held in federal custody, awaiting trial. Samuel drove to the hospital in silence, his mind reeling from the chain of events that had just unfolded. Layers of memory, suspicion, anger, and the pain he had buried deep in his heart for 27 years seemed to have been turned over, page by page, with answers that were ruthlessly clear. But amid the whirlwind of emotion, one thing rose above all else: peace. His mother, Sister Mary Catherine, had not run away, had not crumbled in silence, had not been swallowed by darkness. She had fought, she had believed, and she had sacrificed for the truth. That feeling, strangely, was not sorrow or fury. It was a quiet light rising in his chest, like a single candle glowing in an old chapel, silent, yet unwavering. As he drove toward the town hospital, Samuel thought of the boy he had promised to return to, Paul, a young soul cast adrift in a life of abandonment, who had reminded Samuel of himself, of a time when he too was weak, despairing, waiting for someone to come and say, "You are not alone." He arrived just before midnight. The hospital corridors were quiet, with only the soft sounds of ventilators and the muted glow of fluorescent lights accompanying the night. At the pediatric reception desk, a young nurse looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Monroe, he's still waiting for you," she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the peace that hung over the place. Samuel nodded and made his way to the small room at the end of the hall. When he entered, soft light shone down on the bed where Paul lay, his face pale, but more alert. He was sitting up against a pillow, and his eyes lit up at the sight of him. "You really came back." Paul's voice was weak, but clear. Samuel sat beside the bed and placed the small cloth bag on the side table. "I promised." The boy looked at the bag with something close to reverence. In his voice, a quiet emotion crept in. "My foster mother once told me about the Eucharist, that it's when God enters your heart, that even if you have nothing left, you can still keep him inside." Samuel was silent. He had never been a priest, nor had the authority to perform the Eucharist officially, but he understood what the boy needed, and it wasn't a perfect rite by canon law, but a passing of faith. He took the host and a small cup of grape juice from the bag, his hands trembling slightly. "Do you believe that when you receive this, you're not just taking a ritual, but welcoming life, forgiveness, and love that never fades?" Paul nodded. Samuel bowed his head, and the prayer came to him as naturally as an old melody long memorized. "Lord, this is your body, given to us. Teach us to receive it with faith, with gratitude, and with humility." He offered the bread to Paul. The boy took it with both hands, pressing it to his chest as if afraid it might crumble, then brought it to his lips, silent tears falling as he did. Then Samuel lifted the tiny cup. "And this is your blood, poured out for mankind, so that whoever believes may be forgiven and live." Paul took only a small sip, but his face began to relax. His breathing steadied. A faint smile touched his lips. "I think my mom saw this," he whispered. "She used to say, one day God would send the right person, at the right time." Samuel didn't know what to say. In that moment, he felt he wasn't the one giving anything, but the one being healed. He bowed his head, closed his eyes, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, he prayed, not to ask, not to accuse, but to give thanks. Thanks for knowing the truth. Thanks for finding his mother, not in ashes and bone, but in honest pages, in a final act of courage. Thanks for Paul, for a life that tethered him back to the world, to hope. The boy fell asleep, his face at peace, as if he had never known pain. Samuel quietly packed the Eucharist kit and stood up. Outside the room, the nurse was still waiting. "Will he be all right?" he asked softly. "He's through the fever," she replied. "We're still monitoring him, but the most important thing, his spirit just changed completely." She glanced at the cloth pouch in his hand. "I think you did the right thing." Samuel smiled but said nothing. Sometimes words are unnecessary. He stepped outside, into the night that had fully fallen. The sky stretched wide, thick with stars, glittering like living witnesses to a story once thought buried forever. Samuel Monroe, the son of a nun betrayed, a boy raised in silence and resentment, now stood in the night, unburdened by the past. He looked up and whispered to the deep sky, "Mother, I understand now. I believe. You are still alive." 3 months later, a radiant Sunday morning bathed the forest-side town, as if nature itself were sharing in a new peace. Sunlight spilled over rooftops, through ancient pine groves, and into the stained glass windows of the old convent, now restored as a gathering space for the community. The chapel bells rang out, echoing through the valley, calling not only the faithful, but also those who had once abandoned belief to return. Behind the main sanctuary, in the refurbished sacristy, Samuel Monroe stood before a mirror. He wore a simple liturgical robe, white and violet, borrowed from a priest friend at a nearby church. Not to impersonate anyone, but to step into something deeper. On the table neatly laid out before him was his mother's 1989 sermon notebook. Preserved, rebound in hard cover, wrapped in dark reddish-brown leather. Beneath it lay her final journal, once buried in the cold earth of the cemetery, now encased in glass in the chapel's library, but a copy remained here, always before him. The truth had changed everything. The convent where his mother once lived was now an open space for the public, no longer a place shadowed by fear and deceit. Mother Agnes and Sister Georgia, after their arrest, had confessed the whole truth. The entire town had been shaken. But then, like soil after a storm, healing began. A new lay council was formed. Financial reforms were enacted. The chapel reopened its doors to even those who had never stepped inside. No one expected, least of all Samuel, that he would be invited to serve as a temporary guide. Not because he was the victim's son, but because he was someone who had walked into the darkness to find the light. At first he refused. He had left faith long ago, the very day his mother disappeared. He was the child who had once screamed at God each night, who had raged amid orphanhood, who swore never to believe in the sermons that had killed his mother. But then he remembered her words. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is moving forward even while doubt remains. And so he came back. He took a deep breath, then stepped out of the sacristy. Now a small archive of handwritten notes, drafts, journals, and logbooks from former nuns. Light streamed in through the stained glass windows up front. The chapel was full, not only with the remaining sisters, but with townspeople. Some who had stayed silent for years. Some had once come here as children and left in shame. Now they returned, hesitant yet hopeful. And in the front pew sat Paul, his hair grown back after treatment, sitting with his foster mother. He beamed when he saw Samuel step out. Samuel smiled back and gently touched the edge of his mother's notebook resting on the pulpit. He opened the Bible to the passage she had once planned to preach in her final week, Matthew 18:15-17. He read aloud, calm and steady. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over." He looked up at the congregation. After a pause, he began. "For a very long time, I believed I had been abandoned, that faith was the cause of every loss, that God had been silent when I cried out. But today I stand here to say that faith is not thunder. It is not always miracles. Sometimes faith is just a single step, a question, an apology, a boy in a hospital bed receiving communion with all his heart. Faith is not dead, it is only buried, under layers of doubt, of hurt, and of lies." He placed his hand on his mother's sermon notebook. "And when we unearth the truth, faith rises. Not to seek revenge, not to forget, but to forgive, to live on." A soft "Amen" rippled through the room, growing gently. Samuel looked toward the altar, now restored. A lit candle stood beside an urn, the remains of Sister Mary Catherine, finally confirmed and honored. At last, she rested in the chapel she once served, among those she once protected. "We cannot rewrite the past," Samuel said, "but we can choose how we step into the future. Not with suspicion, but with light." He looked toward Paul. "Not every child is handed hope, but when we begin with truth, hope can grow." A small bell rang from the back. The call to prayer. Samuel bowed his head, eyes closed. In that quiet moment, no one saw his tears, but everyone felt that something had been restored. When he opened his eyes, it wasn't the lights he noticed, but the eyes of the people looking at him, not as a victim, not as one returned, but as an heir to faith. And that was something he had never dared believe he could have. A legacy.